Patricia Gross drove her Range Rover across my front lawn and straight into my Snowman, she thought she was making a point. What she did not know, what nobody in Birchfield Commons knew except me, was that I had built that snowman specifically for her, not the snow part, what was inside the snow part. I had been waiting 11 days for her to do exactly what she did, and when I watched her tires tear across my yard from my living room window at 7:40 in the morning, I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow sip, and said out loud to nobody in particular, "There it is." My name is Warren Chiles. I am 44 years old, a licensed structural engineer with 18 years of experience in load-bearing design and material specifications, and I have lived in the Birchfield Commons HOA community in Northern Ohio for 8 years. My wife Donna teaches high school chemistry. Our son Marcus is 11 and our daughter June is 8, and both of them have inherited from their parents a combination of scientific curiosity and what Donna charitably calls a thorough approach to problems that other people might call something less charitable but equally accurate. We bought our house on Clearfield Drive because the lot was wide with a deep front yard. The school district was excellent, the commute to my firm was manageable, and the neighborhood had the settled quality of a place where people had made long-term decisions and were living inside them. For 6 years, Birchfield Commons was exactly what we had bought. Quiet, orderly, neighborly in the specific way of Northern Ohio neighborhoods where people acknowledged each other and helped when it was needed and otherwise left each other alone in a manner that I found deeply civilized. The HOA was managed by a company called Greenway Property Services, and the board was made up of 5 homeowners who generally met monthly, handled routine business competently, and did not generate drama. Patricia Gross moved in 2 years ago. She bought the house directly across Clearfield Drive from mine, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage that had sat on the market for 8 months because of a foundation issue that the previous owner had disclosed and that had frightened off most buyers. Patricia was not frightened off by foundation issues or by anything else that I observed. She was 55, recently divorced, formerly a corporate attorney in Cleveland, who had taken a settlement and a decade of accumulated grievances and relocated to a quieter situation that she apparently intended to manage with the same energy she had previously applied to litigation. She ran for the HOA board in her 3rd month in the neighborhood and won by a significant margin because she was the only candidate who had submitted a written platform, which consisted of a 12-page document outlining her vision for Birchfield Commons standards enforcement. Most residents either admired the preparation or were too indifferent to vote against it. She became board president in her 4th month, and within 6 weeks had issued more formal violation notices than the board had issued in the previous 2 years combined. Most of her violations were technical and small: trash bins left at the curb past 6 in the evening on collection day, seasonal decorations remaining up past the CC and our specified removal deadlines, vehicles parked on the street for more than the permitted 48 consecutive hours. She enforced these things with the consistency of a system that had been programmed and was now running, and most residents complied because compliance was easier than resistance, and the violations were not unreasonable on their face. She began paying specific attention to my property in her 3rd month on the board. I was not certain at first whether this was targeted or simply the result of a new enforcement mindset being applied uniformly. The first notice cited my basketball hoop, which was portable and stood at the edge of my driveway, as a prohibited structure under Section 4 of the CC and RS governing recreational equipment visibility from the street. I read Section 4. It prohibited permanent recreational structures within the front setback. My hoop was portable and not permanently installed. I wrote a response noting this distinction and citing the specific language. Patricia sent a second notice redefining the term permanent to include any structure present for more than 30 consecutive days. I sent a request for the board resolution that had produced that redefinition. No such resolution existed. The notice was withdrawn. The second notice cited the color of my front door, which I had repainted the previous spring from the original dark red to a deep navy blue, as non-conforming under the CC and R color palette. I pulled the color palette document from the HOA website. Navy blue was listed as an approved accent color. My response included a screenshot of the document with the relevant color highlighted. That notice was also withdrawn. The third notice cited the height of my front yard ornamental grasses, which I had planted along the property edge, as exceeding the maximum permitted height for decorative plantings in the front yard setback. The CC and RS specified no maximum height for ornamental grasses. I noted this in my response. The notice was withdrawn. This pattern continued for 7 months. I documented every notice, every response, and every withdrawal in a folder I kept in my home office because I am a structural engineer and documentation is as natural to me as breathing. By the time the Snowman situation began, I had a folder containing 11 notices and 11 withdrawals, a record that I found useful in the same way I find survey data useful before I design a foundation. December arrived with the kind of early Ohio cold that announces itself seriously, hard frost by mid-November, and the first real snow by the first week of December. Marcus and June were both home on a Saturday when the significant snow came, 8 inches overnight with another 2 falling through the morning, and they were outside building before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I watched them from the kitchen window for a few minutes, and then I put on my coat and went out to help them. We built the Snowman in the front yard, not at the property edge, not close to the street, but roughly centered in the wide front lawn, 20 feet from the sidewalk and 40 feet from the street edge. It was a good snowman, 3 tiers well packed, the base nearly 4 feet in diameter. Marcus had rolled the bottom ball with the systematic determination of a child who approaches physical tasks like engineering problems, moving in concentric circles to collect maximum snow mass. June had decorated with specific intention, 2 pine cones for eyes, a carrot from the refrigerator, a scarf that had been in our coat closet so long nobody was certain whose it was, and a knit cap that Marcus had donated from his own head with the gravity of someone making a real sacrifice. Before I packed the final layer of snow around the middle tier, I placed something inside the Snowman. Not deeply inside, just below the surface of the middle section, packed in firmly but accessible if the outer snow layer was disrupted. I had prepared it 2 days earlier when I had heard the weather forecast and made a decision about how I wanted to handle what I expected was coming. What I placed inside was a digital trail camera, the same make and model I used for wildlife observation at my brother-in-law's property in rural Ohio. A compact unit in a weatherproof housing that activated on motion, logged time-stamped video to an internal card, and could withstand the compression of a snow packing without damage, because I had tested this specifically before I built the Snowman. The camera faced outward through a small aperture in the snow that I shaped to look like part of the texture of the packed surface. I had also placed a second camera on the front eave of my house, already installed from 2 months earlier after the 8th violation notice, angled to cover the front lawn. I had not built a trap. I had built a documentation system in the shape of a snowman. The reason I expected something to happen involved an incident from the previous winter that I had not addressed formally but had not forgotten. In February of that year, before Patricia joined the board, I had built a modest snow fort with Marcus in the front yard. 2 days later, it had been knocked down overnight. I had no proof of who had done it, and Marcus had been upset in the particular way children are upset when something they built is destroyed, and I had told him these things sometimes happened and we would build another one. But I had noted the incident in my documentation folder with the date and a description, and I had noted that Patricia had commented at a neighborhood gathering the following week that certain seasonal structures were inconsistent with community standards, an observation that had seemed oddly specific. The Snowman stood for 11 days. I checked the Eve camera footage each morning, a 90-second review of overnight motion events, and found nothing relevant for the first 10 days. Deer at 3 in the morning on day 4, a raccoon on day 7, my neighbor Frank Elias walking his dog past the sidewalk on day 9 and stopping to look at the Snowman and then giving it a thumbs up, which I found unexpectedly heartening. On the 11th day, which was a Wednesday, I reviewed the overnight footage at 5:30 in the morning and found no events. I went to work. At 7:40, my phone sent a motion alert from the Eve camera. I was at my desk, and I opened the alert and watched the live feed. Patricia Gross's white Range Rover had left her driveway across the street, crossed Clearfield Drive at an angle that was not consistent with any navigational route to anywhere, mounted my curb, driven approximately 15 feet across my front lawn, and struck the Snowman at a speed that collapsed all 3 tiers and spread the snow components across a roughly 12-foot radius. Then she reversed off my lawn, returned to the street, and continued down Clearfield Drive in the direction of the neighborhood exit as though she had done nothing of note. The Snowman's middle tier had been distributed across my front lawn. The inner camera, which was in that tier, was now in the snow on my lawn. It had activated on the impact motion and had logged the strike from the inside of the Snowman, which produced a brief and violent footage record of white compression and then daylight as the snow dispersed. The Eve camera had logged the entire event from approach to departure, including a clear capture of Patricia's license plate. I sat at my desk for a moment, then I called Donna. She answered and I described what I had just watched. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Is the inner camera intact?" I said, "I have not retrieved it yet, but the housing is rated for impact." She said, "Go get it before it gets cold enough to affect the card." I told my office I would be working remotely until noon and drove home. The inner camera was intact. The housing had done its job. The footage from inside the Snowman was brief and disorienting and showed nothing identifiable except the moment of impact, but it was documentation of the physical force applied to the structure from within a few centimeters of contact. Combined with the Eve camera footage showing Patricia's vehicle approaching, mounting the lawn, striking the Snowman, and departing, the documentation was complete. I called Conrad Hess, who was not the same Conrad from the prior stories, but my own property attorney, a man named Conrad Webb, who had handled my closing 8 years ago and who I had retained for a quarterly review of the escalating HOA situation beginning in month 3 of Patricia's board presidency. Conrad answered, and I described the morning's events. He said, "She drove her vehicle across your lawn and struck a structure on your property." I said, "At 7:40 on a Wednesday morning. On camera from 2 angles, including from inside the structure at the moment of impact." He said, "Property damage, reckless operation of a vehicle, trespass. This is a police matter before it is a civil matter. File a report today." I filed a police report at 11 that morning at the Birchfield Township Police Department. The officer who took the report was a sergeant named Dale Kowalski, who watched the Eve camera footage on my phone twice without expression and then said, "She just drove right across your yard." I said, "Yes." He said, "And into the Snowman." I said, "Yes." He looked at me. He said, "You had a camera inside the Snowman." I said I had been anticipating a property incident based on a prior event and a pattern of behavior. I installed documentation equipment accordingly. Sergeant Kowalski looked at me for a moment longer. Then he said, "That is very thorough." He took a full report, copied the Eve footage to the department system, and told me the matter would be reviewed for potential charges and that I would be contacted within 5 business days. He also said that given the vehicle involved and the clear footage, he expected the review to be straightforward. I drove home and photographed the lawn damage in full. The tire tracks were visible across the frost-stiffened grass, 2 clear paths from the curb to the impact site and back. I photographed the dispersed snow components, the flattened area at the impact point, and the scattered decorative elements including the carrot, the pinecones, and Marcus's donated knit cap, which had come to rest approximately 8 feet from the impact site. I measured the tire track dimensions and documented them. I documented the extent of lawn disruption. I then went inside and told Donna what I had found. She stood at the kitchen window looking at the front lawn. She said, "She drove into the Snowman the kids built." I said, "Yes." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Send everything to Conrad." I sent everything to Conrad. Conrad sent a formal notice to Patricia that afternoon by email and certified mail. It documented the incident, cited the time-stamped footage, described the property damage, including the lawn disruption and destruction of the structure, noted the police report case number, and informed her that civil proceedings for property damage and trespass would follow. Marcus came home from school at 3:30 and stood at the front door looking at the dispersed remains of his snowman. He was 11, and he was not a child who cried easily. He stood there for a long time. He said she drove into it. I said yes. He said on purpose. I said the footage indicates it was not accidental. He was quiet, then he said, "Did you get it on camera?" I said, "From 2 angles." He thought about this, then he said, "Good." He went inside and started his homework. June came home 20 minutes later and cried briefly and specifically, and then asked if she could help rebuild it. I said we would rebuild it on the weekend. She said the new one should have something inside it too, just in case. I told her that was a very reasonable position. Patricia did not call, did not come to the door, did not acknowledge the incident in any form for 4 days. On the 4th day, she sent an email to Conrad that her own attorney had apparently drafted. It said that she had been attempting to dislodge a snow accumulation from her front wheel well while executing a turn on the residential street, that her vehicle had briefly crossed the lawn edge, and that any contact with the snow structure had been entirely unintentional. It noted that snow structures on residential lawns were impermanent and not legal property under Ohio statute, and that any damage claim was therefore without merit. Conrad called me after reading it. He said, "She is arguing a snowman is not property." I said, "What does Ohio law say about that?" He said, "Ohio property damage statute covers any object on real property that has been placed there by the owner. A snowman built on your property by your family is your property." Additionally, the tire track evidence and the camera footage showing a direct approach trajectory to the snowman from the street are not consistent with an accidental wheel well correction. I said, "What about the lawn?" He said, "The lawn is unambiguous property damage with clear photographic documentation and measurable repair cost. The snow structure is a secondary element. The lawn damage alone carries the case." I said, "What is the full exposure?" He said, "Lawn repair, police report processing fee, my fees for the civil claim, compensatory damages for the documented intentional act, and I want to add something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "Patricia is an HOA board president who committed a documented act of property damage against a homeowner she has been in an ongoing enforcement dispute with. The HOA's CC and RS include a code of conduct provision for board members. I want to file a formal complaint with Greenway Property Services citing her conduct as a board member, separate from the civil claim." I said, "Do it." The police department contacted me on day 5. Sergeant Kowalski told me that the evidence review had been completed and that Patricia Gross was being issued a citation for negligent operation of a motor vehicle and a citation for criminal mischief, the latter being the Ohio statute that covered intentional damage to another person's property. He said the footage had been determinative. The direct approach trajectory of the vehicle, combined with the absence of any mechanical explanation for the path, made the accidental explanation unsupportable. Patricia's attorney called Conrad the day after the citations were issued. His name was Michael Fenn, and he had the measured voice of someone who had reviewed the footage himself and had already adjusted his client's expectations accordingly. He said, "My client acknowledges that the incident occurred and that her explanation was inadequate. She wants to resolve this." Conrad said, "I am prepared to discuss resolution after the criminal matter is fully processed." Michael Fenn said, "She would prefer to resolve everything simultaneously." Conrad said, "I understand her preference. The timeline I described stands." Patricia was fined $800 on the criminal mischief citation and $400 on the negligent operation citation. She paid both within the required period. Conrad filed the civil claim the week after the citations were processed. The Greenway Property Services complaint moved in parallel. Greenway's response came within 2 weeks. Their community manager, a professional named Stephanie Ortiz, who I had found consistently reasonable in prior dealings, informed me that the board's code of conduct provision required members to conduct themselves in a manner consistent with community standards and to avoid actions that created conflict with or damaged the interests of community members. She said that the documented incident, combined with the 11 prior enforcement notices and their subsequent withdrawals, which Conrad had included in the complaint, presented a pattern that Greenway considered incompatible with Patricia's continued role as board president. Greenway called a special board session. I was not present, but Mabel Okafor, a retired nurse who had been on the Birchfield Commons board for 4 years and who had watched the previous 2 years with increasing discomfort, called me afterward with a summary. She said Patricia had attended and had attempted to characterize the situation as a private dispute between neighbors that had been misrepresented to the management company. She said 3 of the 5 board members had reviewed the footage before the meeting and that the discussion had been brief and the outcome decisive. Patricia was removed from the board presidency by a 4-to-1 vote. The one vote in her favor was her own. She retained her seat as a general board member, which was within the rules, but Mabel was elected president in her place, and the enforcement approach of the board shifted immediately and perceptibly. The first thing the new board did under Mabel's leadership was conduct a review of all outstanding violation notices issued in the previous 2 years. 41 notices were reviewed. 23 were withdrawn as unsupported by the CC&R language as written. Civil settlement negotiations took 3 weeks. The final number was $19,400. Patricia paid it personally. There was no insurance coverage for the intentional act component, which represented the majority of the total. The lawn repair was $1,400. Conrad's fees were $6,000. The remainder was compensatory damages for the documented intentional property destruction and the sustained harassment documented by the 11 notice and withdrawal pattern. Michael Fenn told Conrad during the final negotiation call that Patricia had found the documentation approach unusual for a residential dispute. Conrad said my client is a structural engineer and documents load-bearing evidence as a professional practice. Michael Fenn said that explained quite a lot. We rebuilt the Snowman the following Saturday. Marcus and June and Donna and I, the 4 of us in the front yard in the cold, clear Ohio morning. This Snowman was larger than the first one. Marcus had developed the concentric rolling technique further, and the base was nearly 5 feet in diameter. June had sourced better decorations, including 2 large buttons from Donna's sewing cabinet and a proper corncob pipe she had found at the craft store in town. I did not put a camera inside this one. There was no need. The Eve camera covered the lawn, and the situation that had necessitated the first camera's presence had resolved. I packed the snow around the middle tier and smoothed the surface and stepped back and looked at it. It was a good snowman. Solid foundation, stable tiers, well-proportioned. A structural engineer's snowman, which is to say one that would stand until the temperature made standing impossible rather than falling from any correctable cause. Marcus looked at it for a moment and said, "This one has a better base." I said, "We improved the design." He said, "Good." He went inside to get hot chocolate. Frank Elias walked his dog past the sidewalk that afternoon and stopped and looked at the new snowman. He gave it a thumbs up again. I waved from the porch. The front yard was quiet in the Ohio December. The lawn would need overseeding in the spring where the tire tracks had torn the grass. I had the repair scheduled and the seed ordered. In the spring, it would grow back and you would not be able to see where the damage had been. That is what you do with damage that can be repaired. You document it, you address the cause, and you repair it correctly, and then you do not look at the scar anymore because the work is done and the ground is good, and there is no reason to keep standing there. I went inside. Donna had made soup. Marcus and June were at the kitchen table. The house was warm and the afternoon light was coming through the front windows and through those windows I could see the snowman standing in the yard, solid and centered and not going anywhere. Everything was exactly as it should be.